Okay, I'm going to do a few readings from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Most of his autobiography was written prior to the Revolution, and Benjamin Franklin's thoughts and ideals underwent a significant change during the Revolution. Franklin was one of the last supporters of what you might call the violent contest. This is recording now. So he's one of the last supporters of the violent contest, and he, above all else, he thought that both England and America would be stronger if they remained united in some way. So he was hoping that the King of England would undergo some change on his part, and then when that didn't happen, when the local town started to get burned, when the local villagers were getting slaughtered, Benjamin Franklin made a change of direction. Immediately, he was the first president of the Continental. He was president of the Continental Congress. There was no other, but he was the president of the Continental Congress, where they elected George Washington. Some of his more famous things that he presented at that time, I believe this might have been when he was talking about the turkey as our national bird, but he also said rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, and that's what he wanted as the national motto of the country. And then also for the coinage of the country, he wanted to have a coin that had the symbol of a sundial, and it had the words "Mind your business" on it. That's what he wanted for our stamp, if you will. And our stamp, I think, then became the eagle with arrows and wheat, which symbolizes something to the effect of, we can bring you war, or we can bring you food, stuff like this. 13 stars all around it and so forth. And then when you look on the dollar bills, you got the pyramid with the Eye of Providence at the top of the pyramid. And it has 13 layers in that pyramid, and it does not reach a peak. There's an eye put in that place, and then it's in Latin. I believe it says a new era for the ages. I believe that's what it says, a new era for the ages, which was to symbolize that the world civilizations were in 1776 by the American Revolution and thought processes that went into it, basically the concepts and not having the king oversee all local and foreign politics. Benjamin Franklin was also one of the most loved colonists, having 20,000 people attend his funeral when he died, I believe in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then Benjamin Franklin also started the fire departments, local police departments, libraries, and so forth. He strongly believed in the subscription system. So he did not like the idea of like advertising or having some big organization purchase a paper and print the material from it. He liked the idea of readers all contributing a roughly equal amount in order to support the organization and the publications that they would make. So, moving on to Exerts' autobiography. I'm going to read quite a lot, but I'll just try to do some highlights here. Okay, I'll read passages, and then I'll explain them briefly what he's talking about in these passages, because I don't have time to read the whole thing. This is on page 1. Since such a repetition is not to be expected, the next thing most like living one's life over again seems to be a recollection of that life, and to make that recollection as durable as possible by putting it down in writing. So here this talks about preservation of history, and Benjamin Franklin wanted to preserve his thoughts and ideas through an autobiography so that they would be passed on to children. Okay, some other things talked about here. I'll just read little excerpts here. Inquiry was made, this is on page 7. Inquiry was made after the removers. We were discovered and complained of. Several of us were corrected by our fathers, and though I pleaded the usefulness of the work, mine convinced me that nothing was useful which was not honest. So this is probably regarding that Benjamin Franklin is probably up to some mischief and making money already. So okay, I'll keep moving on to excerpts, and then okay. So to return, I continued thus employed in my father's business for 2 years, that is, till I was 12 years old, and my brother John, who was bred to that business, having left my father, married and set up for himself at Rhode Island, appearance that I was destined to supply his place and become a tallow chandler. So essentially, for 2 years, that is. So Franklin continued at his father's business from 10 to 12, and then at 12 he was to be the more or less servant to his brother. This is as the internship process worked back at this time, and this is a big part of the revolution that a lot of people don't talk about today, but it was that you had maybe 10 children, and your eldest son received the inheritance of his practices, and the younger brothers and daughters and so forth, but brothers, were to work for him. They were essentially to be what you might think of as the slaves, but they were to help out in the business practice and always serve him until at least the age of 22, at which time they were allowed to do their own things to some degree. Okay. But my dislike to the trading continued. My father was under apprehension, as if he did not find one for me more agreeable. I should break away and get to sea, as his son Josiah had done, to his great vexation. So his father was worried that Benjamin Franklin would take off on a boat. He therefore sometimes took me to walk with him and his joiners, bricklayers, turners, braziers, and their work, that he might observe my inclination and endeavor, and to fix on me some trade other on land. Okay. My father's little library consisted chiefly of books in divinity, most of which I read, and have since often regretted that at a time when I was in such a thirst for knowledge, more proper books had not fallen my way, since it was now resolved I should be a clergyman. So, Benjamin Franklin is talking about when he was 12ish, that he was very thirsty for knowledge and wanting to read scientific publication, but the books available to him were on divinity, more spacious or more mythical in nature, rather than scientific, as he kind of preferred. I stood out some time, but at last was persuaded and signed the indentures when I was yet but 12 years old. I was to serve an apprentice till I was 21, only I was to be allowed at journeyman's wages during the last year. Okay, so this is when he signed the indentured paperwork. I believe this was to his brother. A question was once more, somehow or another, started between Collins and me of the propriety of educating the female sex in learning and their abilities to studies. Of the opinion that it was improper and that they were naturally unequal to it. I took the contrary side, perhaps a little for dispute's sake. Okay, moving on. So, just to refresh, that at this time it was questioned whether or not women could learn equally to men. It's kind of sad in some respect, but it's also a little, it can be a little bit amusing that people thought that women just couldn't learn. I find that a little bit barbarous, but moving on. Therefore, I took some tales of the turn in verse and had pretty well forgotten the prose, turning them back again. I also sometimes jumbled my collections of hints into confusion, and after some weeks endeavored to reduce them into the best order, before I began to form the full sentences and complete the paper. This was to teach me the method in arrangement of thoughts. So I thought that was really interesting there. And that's where Benjamin Franklin would take his works, cut them up, if you will, mix them up, forget about them for a week, and then try to arrange them again. And then maybe cut them up, forget about them again for a week, and then see if he repeated arrangement or if he had different ideas in terms of the collections of thoughts, as he put it. When he's 16 years old, he started a vegetable diet, which did not last particularly long. Okay. And here my brother and the rest going from the printing house to their meals, I remember there alone and dispatching presently my light repast, which often was more than a biscuit or a slice of bread, a handful of raisins or a tart from the pastry cooks, and a glass of water, had the rest of the time till their return for study, in which I made the greater progress from the greater clearness of head and quicker apprehension which usually attended temperance in eating and drinking. So this went on to become one of his virtues, which was if you overeat, then you become sluggish and you spend too much time eating, which Franklin is talking about how he was able to forego a big meal in favor of studying and essentially gain advantage over his peer group, or his superiors rather. I found this method safest for myself and very embarrassing to those against whom I used it. Therefore, I took a delight in it. This is talking about one of his... Okay, I'll read this bit. While as an intern on improving my language, I met in the English grammar, I think it was Greenwood's, at the end of which there were 2 little sketches of the arts of rhetoric and logic, and later finishing with a specimen of a dispute in the Socratic method. And soon after I procured Xenophon of Socrates, Xenophon's Memorable Things of Socrates, wherein there are many instances of the same method. I was charmed with it, adopted it, and dropped my abrupt contradiction and positive argumentation, and put on the humble inquirer and doubter, and being then, from reading Shaftesbury and Collins, became a real doubter in many points of our religious doctrine. So prior to this, Franklin was quite argumentative, and he would present the ways that he thought were correct, which was effective but not really winning him too many friends. People were quick to just more or less ignore him, and then he went on to adopting the Socratic method, or basically making people question their beliefs, and went on the phrase that I liked is I found this method safest for myself and very embarrassing to those against whom I used it, therefore I took delight in it. This is just talking about intellectual competition. Franklin was very intellectually competitive. Okay, my brother had in 1720 and 1721, so I referenced this for in 1720-21. This is when Franklin was maybe around 12 at this time, I believe. Yeah, okay. At 21, he'd be 15. But so, I want to just kind of get the impression that in 1720, he was about 15. By 1776, he would be some 70 years old, perhaps. So, in either case, he is largely considered one of the fathers of the Revolution, and the first American, as he was kind of older than a majority of the other revolutionists. Not all of them, but older than a good chunk of them, being 70 at the time of the war. Okay. My brother had, and also a lot of the revolutionists grew up reading Benjamin Franklin's materials in terms of getting inspiration for their ideas. Okay. My brother had in 1720 or 21 begun to print a newspaper. It was the second that appeared in America and was called the New England Current. The only one before it was the Boston News Letter. So his brother had the second newspaper in town. Okay. I contrived to disguise an anonymous paper. I put it in at night and under the door of the printing house. So I thought this was particularly clever. Again, so Franklin, I'm going to call him 14 at the time. Franklin, no, he's 15 year. Okay, Franklin, while he was 15, his brother was not allowing him to get his articles printed in the paper. So this was in order to keep him as a servant to him. So what Franklin did was he wrote anonymous articles, put them under the door. You'll see here that his brother liked them, and his brother printed 3 or 4 or 5. And then once it got revealed that Franklin was the writer of these anonymous articles, his brother was quite upset. And this kind of proved to the point of Franklin that when it comes to intellectual work, it makes a big difference as to who is the one who speaks it. When Franklin, as a 15-year-old, was speaking it to his elder brother was quick to tell him that his intellectual work was terrible, but when it came from an anonymous source and free of charge, his brother felt that the intellectual work was fantastic and made him a lot of money. Okay. Our disputes were often brought before our father, and I fancy it was either generally in the right or else a better pleader, because the judgment was generally in my favor. Okay. My father was passionate and had often beaten me, which I took extremely amiss, and thinking my apprenticeship very tedious, I was continually wishing for some opportunity to shorten it, which at length offered me in the manner unexpected. One of the pieces in our newspaper, on some which I had now forgotten, had given offense to the assembly, and he was taken up and censored and imprisoned for a month by the speaker's warrant, and I suppose because he would not discover his author. Okay, so his brother was imprisoned for a month for offending the assembly at the time, which I just find, again, amusing. Granted, freedom of speech is kind of a different issue, but at this time, when they censored speech, they would imprison you for a month if you said some bad stuff, or if you didn't disclose your source. Such as in this situation, his brother would not discover his author. His brother would not reveal his source of material, so he got imprisoned. And again, just to remind people, this is in 1720. Okay, moving on. During my brother's confinement, which I resented a good deal, ending our private differences, I had the management of the paper and made bold to give our rulers some rub in it, which my brother took very kindly, while others began to consider me in an unfavorable light as a young genius that had a turn for libeling and satire. My brother's discharge was accompanied with an order of the House, a very odd one, that James Franklin should no longer be called the New England Current. There was okay, so anyways, moving on. So when Franklin at 15 was given charge of the paper while his brother was in jail for offending the king, Franklin went on to offend the king again. And it's a little bit different when you have a 15-year-old being able to present ideas that are so offensive to the king that he did not imprison him at this time, but he felt like he was a danger to society. Moving on. When I reflect that I had already made myself a little obnoxious to the governing body, okay. I then thought of going to New York as the nearest place where there was a printer, and I was rather inclined to leave Boston. When I reflected that I had already made myself a little obnoxious to the governing party and the arbitrary proceedings of the assembly in my brother's case, it was likely I might, if I stayed, soon bring myself into scrape. And father, that my indiscreet disputations about religion began to make me pointed at with horror by good people as an infidel or atheist. Okay, well, Franklin was very religious forever, But in terms of the way he viewed religion was quite different. He didn't favor the hierarchy nature of some religions. He believed, in terms of political thinking, in terms of spiritual thinking, he believed that the spirit was built within you, and then got presented without. So that the battle is always an internal battle, rather than the purpose of spirituality is to make giant crosses or whatever the case may be. He felt differently than that. Moving on. Okay. I began now to have some acquaintance among the young people of the town that were lovers of reading, and whom I spent my evenings very pleasantly in gaining money by my industry and frugality. I lived very agreeably, forgetting Boston as much as I could, and not desiring that any there should know where I reside except my friend Collins, who was my secret, and I kept it when I wrote to him. Okay, so this is, let me see where he is at this time. This is if he's in New York. Yeah, I think he's in New York at this time. And so this just talks again to Franklin's kind of changing nature. So in one aspect, we've already heard about Franklin taking his ideas, cutting them up, shifting them around, waiting a week till he forgotten about them, and then seeing if he'd arrange them in the same way he did before. Test the truthfulness of arrangement of thought against himself. And then seeing Franklin do an anonymous paper in order to see how people reacted to the same ideas, one presented from him as a 15-year-old and one presented as an anonymous source, presumably from a more credentialed party. And then we've also seen Franklin take rub against the magistrate and his brother. He felt had an unfair trial, and he felt that he would have a similar unfair trial had he continued to do so. And likewise, he's been challenging some aspects of religion. And so here, Franklin runs off to New York, I believe. And instead of telling his family and all others where he left to, because he would have been in trouble because he had signed some paperwork that said that he'd work for his brother till he's 21. And this was when he's about 14, maybe 15. But he'd worked with his brother until he's 21, and he'd only worked with his brother maybe 2 years now. So the skills, or some of the skills, of printing papers, but he'd not provided his 7 more years of service. And as Franklin mentioned, he was getting occasional beatings by his brother, and his brother was not allowing him to have any editorial hand, which so he decided to tell one friend, Collins, which he calls my secret. So he would tell Collins, and then Collins would secretly tell his family, and in this way his family would not know from where the messages came, and it was much more difficult for them to trace to where Benjamin Franklin had run off to. Okay. I was better dressed than ever while in his service, having a Gentile new suit from head to foot, a watch, and my pockets lined with near £5 He received me not very frankly, looked me all over, and turned to his work again. So here, Franklin is coming back home from his ventures in New York, and he was very successful. The journeymen were inquisitive where I had been, what sort of country it was, and how I liked it. I praised it much, and the happy life I led, and expressing strongly my intention of returning to it, and one of them asking what kind of money we had there. I produced a handful of silver and spread it before them, which was kind of a rare show. They had not been used to it, paper being the money of Boston. Then I took an opportunity of letting them see my watch, and lastly, my brother, still glum and solemn, I gave them a piece of 8 to drink, and took my brother leave. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about some of the ways in which they discussed the finances at the time. So a piece of 8 to drink was kind of interesting. I felt using that terminology in terms of his drink. And then paper money versus silver money, Boston being on paper and New York being on silver. And then just the lack of travel in the area. Benjamin Franklin had traveled to New York, from Boston to New York, and very few people were very interested and had not seen the silver money yet. Okay. Here stuck to my resolution of not eating animal food, and on this occasion I considered it with my master Tyrion, the taking every fish as a kind of unprovoked murder, since none of them had or ever could do us any injury that might justify the slaughter. All this seemed very reasonable, but I had formerly been a great lover of fish, and when this came hot out of the frying pan, I smelt it admirably well. I balanced some time between principle and inclination, till I recollected that, when fish were opened, I saw smaller fish taken out of their stomachs. Then I thought, if you eat one another, I don't see why we mustn't eat you. So I dined upon cod very heartily, and continued to eat, and returned only now and then occasionally to a vegetable diet. So convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables me to find or make reason for everything one has a mind to do. So here is just having a little fun with himself to some regard. He preferred the idea of being a vegetarian, but then and he considered killing of animals and eating animals as slaughter. And through reason, he decided that killing the animals was what's going on here? Killing the animals, since they kill each other, why mustn't he kill them too, or whatever? Since they eat each other, why must he not eat them? And thus he says, so convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do. Okay, another part of the discussion. I dislike both, but agreed to admit them upon the condition of his adoption of the doctrine of using no animal food. I doubt, said he, my constitution will not bear it. I assured him that it would, and that he would be better for it. He was usually a great glutton. I promised myself some diversion in half starving him. He agreed to the practice, if I would keep him company. I did so, and we held it for 3 months. And then moving on here. I went on pleasantly, but poor Keimer suffered grievously. Tired of the project, longed for the flesh pots of Egypt, he ordered a roast pig. He invited me and 2 women friends to dine with him, but it being brought too soon upon table, he could not resist the temptation and ate the whole before we came. So this is just talking about how when his boss wouldn't pay Benjamin Franklin enough money that he felt he was due when he's 16 or so, he said, well, I'll accept the smaller wages if you agree to go on a vegetable diet. And Franklin felt that the smaller wages would be worth it for the satisfaction to know that halfway starving his boss. And here the boss gives in and eats an entire roast pig or whatever. Okay. Other parts. He's not so jealous of you. I wish, therefore, you would take his place and produce it as yours. I will pretend not to have had time, and so produce nothing. We shall then see what he shall say to it. I was agreed, and immediately transcribed it that it might appear in my own hand. Okay, what is this? Okay, I should have read this part at the start. Okay. When the time of our meeting drew nigh, Rolf called on me first and let me know his piece was ready. I told him I had been busy and had little inclination, had done nothing. He then showed me my opinion. I had much approved of it, and as it appeared to me to have great merit. Now, he says, Osborne never will allow the least merit in anything of mine, but makes 1,000 criticisms out of mere envy. He is not so jealous of you I wish, therefore, that you would take the piece and produce it as yours. As agreed, and immediately transcribed it. So again, this guy is nervous about presenting his work, so he wanted it to be presented with the name Benjamin Franklin on it. And Benjamin Franklin said, yeah, that sounds great. Okay. We met. Watson's performance was read, and there are some beauties in it, and many defects. Osborne's was read, and it was much better. Ralph did it justice, remarked some faults, but applauded the beauties. He himself had nothing to produce. I was backward, seemed serious of being excused, and had not time to correct, etc., but no excuse could be admitted. Produce I must. It was read and repeated, and Watson and Osborne gave up the criticism and joined in applauding it. Ralph only made some criticisms and proposed some amendments, but I defended my text. Osborne was against Ralph and told him he was no better a critic than poet. So he doubted the argument. As the two went home together, Osborne expressed himself still more strongly in the favor of what he thought my production, having restrained himself before, as he said, lest I should think it flatly. But who would have imagined, said he, that Franklin had been capable of such force, such fire? He has even improved the original. In his common conversation, he seems to no choice of words. He hesitates and blunders, and yet, good God, how he writes. Discovered the trick. We had played him, and Osborne was a little laugh at. Okay. The transaction fixed Ralph in his resolution of becoming a poet. Interesting. But all the same, so again, more about the author of material matters more than the material itself. Okay. Osborne went to West Indies, where he became an eminent lawyer and made money, but died young. He and I had made a serious agreement that one who happened first to die should, if possible, make a friendly visit to the other and acquaint him how he found things in that separate state. But he never fulfilled his promise. Oh, this is in terms of the materials that Franklin had read while he's in his dad's. This deals with being a ghost, and Franklin and Osborne made an agreement that whoever should die first should come back as a ghost and tell the other person what to prepare for. But Osborne never came back to Benjamin Franklin and told him what the afterlife was like. So but he fulfilled his promise, is the way he worded it. Okay. Another part. On my expressing some concern about what I should do, he advised me to endeavor getting some employment in the way of my business. Among the printers, said he, you will improve yourself, and when you return to America, you'll set up greater advantage. So this was talking about going to London, because printing was more popular in London and more competitive. And so here Franklin takes on to go to London. I immediately got into my work at Palmer's, then a famous printing house, and here I continued for a year and was pretty diligent, but spent with Ralph a good deal of my earnings in going to plays and other places of amusement. We had together consumed all my pistolas, and now we rubbed on from him. He seemed quite to forget his wife and child, and I, by digress, my engagements with Miss Reed, to whom I never wrote more than one letter, and that was to let her know that I was not likely soon to return. This was another of the great errata of my live over again. In fact, by her expenses, I was constantly kept unable to pay my passage. So, essentially, him and Ralph went to England, and then Ralph kind of forgot his wife and child that he left in America, and Franklin had been somewhat engaged to a woman in America whom he only wrote one letter to. And I believe he was in London for about 4 years or so. Ages of 16 and 21, thereabouts. Alright, And then here, this is kind of fun. This is kind of interesting. This, however, okay, this is dealing with Ralph and Franklin. This, however, he deemed a business below him and confident of future better fortune, when he should be unwilling to have it known that he once was so meanly employed. He changed his name and did me the honor of assuming mine, for I soon after had a letter from him acquainting me that he was settled in a small village in Berkshire. I think it was, where he taught reading and writing to 10 or a dozen boys at sixpence, recommending Miss T to my care and desiring me to write to him, directing of Mr. Franklin, schoolmaster, at such a place. I don't know if Mr. Franklin was a schoolmaster or whatever. Let's see here. He continued to write frequently, sending me large specimens of an epic poem, which he had been composing and desiring my remarks and corrections. I'm going to move on a little bit. And borrowed that I could spare to help him out of them. I grew fonder of her company, and being at that time under no religious restraint and presuming upon my importance to her, I attempted familiarities and another erratum, which she repulsed with a proper resentment and acquainted him with my behavior. Okay, I don't know. This is something about Benjamin Franklin getting a little handsy, perhaps. Okay, let's see. He drank on, however, and had 4 or 5 shillings to pay out of his wages every Saturday night for that muddling liquor, an expense I was free from. And thus these poor devils kept themselves under. So this is talking about how a lot of people in London in particular, I believe, was, they were, well, no, this is probably back in the colonies, but these colony workers were discussing about how, Ben Franklin was just, he would eat a biscuit and drink water, and he would say, well, this is the same stuff that you're getting in the beer, and people would be like, you need that strong beer, and Franklin said that this was better, and then they would pay more for the beer, and essentially they would spend their day's wages at the pint house. Okay, let's see what this says. I respected and loved him, and we might have gone on together very, very happy. But in the beginning of February 1726, when I was just past my 21st year, we both were taken ill. My distemper was pleurisy, which very near carried me off. I suffered a good deal and gave up the point of my own mind and rather disappointed him. I found myself regretting in some degree that I must now, some time or other, have all the disagreeable work to do all over again. I forgot that his distemper it held him a long time, and at length carried him off. He left me a small legacy in a non-captive will, as a token of his kindness to me, and left me once more to the wide world, for the store had taken into the care of his executors, and my employment under him ended. Okay. They're just talking about, just talking about how, at this time, people were getting kind of, they were getting sick and dying off time to time. Okay. John, the Irishman, soon ran away, and with the rest, I began to live very agreeably, for they all respected me the more as they found Keimer incapable of instructing them, and that from learned something daily. Okay, we never worked on Saturday, and being Keimer's Sabbath, so I had 2 days for reading. My acquaintance with ingenious people in the town increased. Keimer himself treated me with great civility and apparent regard, and it now made me uneasy, but my debt to Vernon, which I was yet unable to pay, being hereto but a poor economist, he, however, kindly made no demand of it. So this is Franklin really getting into his studies now when he's around 22 and so forth, and talking about whenever he had 2 days off in a row, he's like, great, holy smokes. Kind of interesting. So I'm gonna speed up this little part. Okay. I grew convinced that truth, sincerity, and integrity in dealings between man and man were of the utmost importance to the facility of life, and I formed written resolutions, which I still remain in my journal book, to the practice them ever while I lived. The revelation has indeed no weight with me as such, but entertained an opinion that through certain actions might not be bad because they were forbidden by it, or good because it commanded them, yet probable might be forbidden because they were bad for us, or commended because they were beneficial for us, and their own natures are all the circumstances of things considered. And in this persuasion, with the kind hand of Providence, or some guardian angel, or accidental favorable circumstances and situations, are altogether preserved me through the dangerous times of youth, and the hazardous situations which I was sometimes in among strangers, remote from the eye and vice of my without any wilful gross immorality or injustice that might have been expected from my want of religion. I say wilful, because the instance I have mentioned had something of necessity in them, from my youth of inexperience in the knavery of others. I had therefore a tolerable character to begin the world with. I valued it properly, and determined to preserve it. So this is him discussing his character. I'm going to read this. Let's see what this says. Whatever is right, though pure-blind man sees but a part of the chain, the nearest link, his eyes not carrying to the equal beam that poses all above. So this is kind of interesting. So that's just discussing how man cannot see everything and is always blind to all of the truth, and he sees but only the most recent truth. Okay, I know I'm going to run out of battery here. Okay, this man continued we're on page 45 at this point. This man continued to business probably I ever should have done. This man continued to live in the decaying place and to in the same strain, refusing for many years to buy a house. Therefore, because all was going to destruction, at last I had the pleasure of seeing him give 5 times as much for one as he might have bought it for when he first began his croaking. I should have before that in the autumn of the preceding club I had formed most of the ingenious acquaintances into a club of mutual improvement, which we called the Junto. We met on Friday evenings. The rules that I drew up required that every member in his turn should produce one or more queries on any point of morals, politics, or natural philosophy, to be discussed by the company, and once in 3 months produce and read an essay of his own writing on any subject he pleased. Our debates were under the direction of the president, and to be conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness for dispute or desire of victory, and to prevent warmth all expressions of positiveness and opinion or direct contradictions, whereafter sometime may contraband and prohibit under small pecuniary penalties. So this is so one thing this man is talking about, the colonies are going to crap, and so he never bought a house, and then he ended up paying 5 times more for his house when he ended up buying one. And then also one of the most important things Benjamin Franklin ever did, most likely, was forming his Junto of 12 people. Okay, we can speak more of that at another time. But my giving of this account here is to show something of the interest I had. Every one of these exerting themselves and recommending business to us. So again, in his Junto, Benjamin Franklin had a strong opinion that all should contribute a little, or should try to get a little bit from each person, rather than one person leading the group. And Benjamin Franklin also later in life, as he was kind of the opinion that knowledge should be treated on its own merit, often did not put his name on things because people were more apt to enjoy it because it would say Benjamin Franklin on it and so forth. So I will take a pause there. He talks about what... Whoops. Yeah, I think things are shutting down. Okay, he talks about a thing with George Webb where Webb, Benjamin Franklin had the idea of opening a paper, and somebody opened the paper instead of him, basically beating him to the punch. And then Franklin essentially gave free editorials to the competing paper, the one that Franklin wanted to destroy. So he approved the competing paper so that his friend who stole his idea would get crushed via these free writings of Franklin to the competitor. And then his friend offered to sell him the paper that he had started for a trifling, which Franklin then bought and then stopped helping the competitor. That was just to talk about some of the business dealings of Benjamin Franklin and how he dealt with competitors when someone kind of betrayed him, rather than like dealing with him directly, you might say. He would go out and make it so that the business venture was no longer profitable and try to acquire the leftovers when it was all done. And he talks about here, we afterwards obtained a charter and the company increased to 100 people. This was the mother of all North American subscription libraries, now so numerous. So Franklin's library was one of the most numerous libraries, containing 100 members, and one of the first subscription libraries where they shared books, and kind of you paid a subscription approximately equal to you paid a price equal to about the value of a book, and if you did not return the book, then your subscription was not given back to you. In addition, you paid another small annual type of thing. These libraries have improved the general conversation of the Americas, made the common tradesmen and farmers as intelligent as most gentlemen from other countries, and perhaps have contributed in some degree to the stand so general made throughout the colonies in defense of their privileges. So here Franklin discusses how the average farmer and tradesman was as intelligent as essentially the college-educated people of England, which, if you remember Charles Dickens, this was referred to as becoming a gentleman. Men were sent off to gentleman school to become educated, which is equivalent to college today, you could say, but perhaps a little bit more civil and more informality, you could say scientific education, but all the same. So now the average farmer was as the average person in Philadelphia, intelligent as the most educated or the more educated persons of England. This created and Franklin said that this contributed to a great degree in the general stand made throughout the colonies in defense of their privilege. So Franklin felt that having a very educated public helped in fighting and in their own rights, and he also felt that having the average person very highly educated was the way of advancing society, rather than, you could say, what some people might think of as a small group of rebels beating up a king and killing a king. Franklin felt education was the root of what provided the support for the general rebellion that followed some 45 years after Franklin started his libraries and Juntos. Alright, thanks for listening. That is part 1 of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography.